Blood and honor. The brutal truth. History books don't tell you about Vikings. Hello, native speakers enthusiasts. Today we're diving deep into the world of the Vikings, but not the sanitized version you might have learned in school. We're uncovering the raw, brutal, and sometimes shocking truth about these Norse warriors who changed the course of European history forever. Beyond the horned helmets first, let's clear something up. Vikings never actually wore horned helmets into battle. This was a 19th century invention popularized by costume designers in opera. Real Viking helmets were typically simple, conical designs made of iron, often with a nose guard, practical protection for warriors who lived and died by their combat skills. What's truly fascinating is that helmets were actually rare and expensive. Archaeological evidence suggests that most Vikings went into battle with no head protection at all, relying instead on their shield wall tactics and ferocity. Only the wealthiest warriors could afford quality armor, a sobering thought when you consider the brutality of their combat. The Blood Eagle. Ritual or myth? You may have heard whispers of the infamous Blood Eagle, supposedly a gruesome execution method where victims had their ribs severed from their spine and pulled outward to resemble bloody wings, while their lungs were pulled through the wounds. While medieval texts mention this ritual, modern scholars debate whether it was actually practiced or if it was propaganda created by Christian writers to demonize the pagan Vikings. What we do know for certain is that Vikings did practice human sacrifice during important religious ceremonies. At Uppsala in Sweden, accounts describe ritual killings where victims were hung in sacred groves as offerings to the gods. Archaeological evidence at burial sites confirms that slaves and servants were sometimes sacrificed to accompany their masters into the afterlife, a practice that speaks volumes about Viking social hierarchy and religious beliefs. Maritime geniuses. While popular culture focuses on their violence, the Vikings' most impressive achievement was actually their seafaring technology. Their longships were revolutionary. Shallow drafted vessels that could navigate both deep oceans and shallow rivers, allowing Vikings to strike hundreds of miles inland when most naval powers were restricted to coastlines. A particularly fascinating detail. Vikings navigated without compasses using sunstones, crystalline calcite, that could detect the position of the sun even on cloudy days by polarizing light. This technology was so advanced that modern scientists have only recently verified how effective it was. Vikings also used sunboards, primitive sundials, and an intimate knowledge of bird migration patterns and ocean currents to cross thousands of miles of open ocean reliably. A society of poet warriors. Perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Viking culture was their complex relationship with language and poetry. These supposed barbarians placed enormous value on eloquence and wordcraft. The most respected Vikings were often skilled poets as well as fighters, able to compose complex verses called skaldic poetry that followed intricate metrical rules. These poems weren't just entertainment, they were how history was preserved. Before writing became common, Vikings memorized thousands of lines recounting battles, genealogies, and mythological stories. Some Viking rulers kept court poets, skalds, specifically to compose poems glorifying their deeds, creating what amounted to propaganda in verse form. What's truly surprising is that insulting someone with a cleverly composed verse was considered so damaging to reputation that it could be grounds for legal action or even justified killing the poet in Viking law codes. Words literally had power of life and death. The hygiene paradox. One of history's great ironies, while Vikings were feared across Europe as savage raiders, they were actually significantly cleaner than the people they terrorized. Archaeological findings show that Vikings used ear spoons, tweezers, combs, and razors as part of regular grooming routines. Saturday was known as washing day, laugardagar, in Norse culture, the origin of the modern word Saturday in Scandinavian languages. English chronicles actually complain that Vikings were dangerously attractive to Anglo-Saxon women because they bathed regularly, combed their hair, and changed their clothes frequently. This fastidiousness about personal appearance stands in stark contrast to the typical European of the Dark Ages, who might go months without bathing. The berserker truth. No discussion of Vikings would be complete without mentioning berserkers, warriors who supposedly fought in an uncontrollable, trance-like fury. These elite fighters were said to wear bear, bircher skins, circer, in battle, and were immune to pain and fear. Modern scholars believe berserkers likely used combinations of alcohol, mushrooms, particularly Amanita muscaria, and self-induced battle hypnosis to enter their frenzied states. What's particularly interesting is that berserkers weren't universally admired. Viking sagas often portray them as problematic figures whose uncontrollable rage made them dangerous to friend and foe alike. Archaeological evidence from warrior graves shows abnormal wear patterns on teeth consistent with habitual rope biting, possibly a technique used during battle frenzy to channel aggression. These warriors literally ground down their teeth in combat rage, a chilling physical reminder of the extremes of Viking battle psychology. Women in Viking society. While Viking society was patriarchal, women enjoyed rights that were remarkably progressive for the medieval period. They could own property, initiate divorce, and run businesses. A Viking wife typically carried keys to the household's storage chests at her belt, a symbol of her authority over domestic affairs. Recent archaeological evidence has upended our understanding of Viking gender roles, with the discovery that some warrior burials, complete with swords, shields, and other battle gear, belonged to women. While debate continues about how common female warriors were, these findings suggest that the boundaries between male and female roles may have been more flexible than previously thought. The strategic minds behind the brutality. Vikings weren't mindless marauders. They were sophisticated strategists. Their raids weren't random but carefully timed to religious festivals when they knew valuables would be displayed in churches and towns would be vulnerable. They understood psychological warfare, using terror tactics to break resistance and extract tribute without fighting. Perhaps most impressively, Vikings created the largest trade network of their era, connecting lands from North America to Baghdad. They weren't just taking wealth through violence. They were skilled merchants who traded amber, furs, walrus ivory, and slaves across thousands of miles. The end of an era. The Viking Age didn't end with a decisive defeat, but through a process of cultural assimilation. As Vikings settled in conquered territories, they gradually adopted Christianity and local customs. The very adaptability that made them successful raiders ultimately led to their cultural absorption. In 1066, the last great Viking ruler, Harald Hardrada, fell at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England, just days before the more famous Battle of Hastings. It's one of history's great ironies that the Norman conquest that followed was led by descendants of Vikings who had settled in France just a few generations earlier. The Vikings hadn't really lost, they had simply transformed. Why this history matters. The brutal truth about Vikings reveals something important about human nature and history itself. These weren't one-dimensional barbarians, but complex people with sophisticated technology, art, literature, and social structures who also committed acts of extraordinary violence. Their story reminds us that civilization and brutality often coexist, a lesson as relevant in our world today as it was 1,000 years ago. When we look beyond the simplified versions of history we're often taught, we find truths about ourselves that are both unsettling and illuminating. The Vikings weren't just fearsome warriors, they were poets, traders, explorers, and innovators who changed the face of Europe forever, leaving their mark in our languages, legal systems, and even our DNA. Their legacy lives on not just in museums and history books, but in the very foundations of our modern world. Viking justice, brutal but balanced. What many do not realize is that Viking society had a sophisticated legal system that predated many European courts. Their community gatherings, called things, pronounced tings, were democratic assemblies where disputes were settled and laws created through consensus. Viking justice could be brutally practical. For example, if you were caught stealing, you might have your hand cut off, not just as punishment, but as a permanent mark identifying you as a thief. However, their system also recognized degrees of intent and circumstance that wouldn't become common in Western law for centuries. Perhaps most shocking to modern sensibilities was the concept of weregild, literally, man gold, a payment system where virtually any crime, including murder, could be compensated with the right payment to the victim's family. A person's weregild was determined by their social status, with noblemen worth more than commoners. This created a society where violence had clear, quantifiable consequences, rather than moral absolutes. The truth about Viking raids on monasteries. When Vikings attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 CE, an event traditionally marking the beginning of the Viking Age, they shocked Christian Europe by targeting sacred sites. But this wasn't random cruelty, it was strategic genius. Monasteries were essentially unguarded banks, containing tremendous wealth in gold, silver, and jeweled religious artifacts. They also housed vulnerable, educated people who could be ransomed or sold as high-value slaves. From the pragmatic Viking perspective, monasteries were perfect targets. Wealthy, poorly defended, and often located near navigable waterways. What history books often gloss over is that Christian kingdoms had been executing pagan Saxons and destroying their religious sites for decades before the Viking raids began. While not excusing Viking brutality, these raids can partly be understood as retaliation against a religion they saw as hostile to their own gods and way of life. The slave economy behind the raids, the uncomfortable truth behind Viking expansion, was its dependence on human trafficking. The Old Norse word thrall, the origin of our modern term, enthralled, referred to slaves who had no legal rights and could be bought, sold, or killed at their owner's discretion. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows that up to 25% of some communities were enslaved people. Dublin, founded by Vikings, became medieval Europe's largest slave market. Most Vikings weren't full-time warriors, but farmers who went a Viking, raiding, seasonally, with captured slaves being one of their most valuable commodities. Slave collars with owner tags have been found in archaeological sites, and Viking sagas matter-of-factly describe the brutality inflicted on thralls. This slave-based economy funded the beautiful art, impressive ships, and trading networks that we often celebrate as Viking achievements. A dark foundation for their cultural accomplishments that history books frequently minimize. Technological innovators, not just warriors. Viking blacksmiths created some of the most feared weapons of the age, including the infamous Ulfberht swords, blades of such high carbon content and minimal impurities that they were centuries ahead of their time. Modern metallurgists have struggled to reproduce these blades using period-appropriate methods, suggesting the Vikings possessed advanced metallurgical knowledge that was later lost. Their shipbuilding techniques were revolutionary. Viking longships used a flexible hull design that could twist with the waves instead of fighting against them, allowing these vessels to survive conditions that would destroy more rigid ships. They pioneered the use of keels for stability and employed overlapping planks, clinker-built construction that made their ships both lighter and stronger than their contemporaries. Perhaps most impressive was their development of sunstones, likely pieces of Iceland spar that could locate the sun on cloudy days by polarizing light. This allowed Vikings to navigate with remarkable accuracy even without seeing the stars or sun directly, effectively creating a primitive polarized light compass centuries before the technology was officially discovered. The psychological warriors. Vikings understood psychological warfare at a sophisticated level. They deliberately cultivated a terrifying image, using tactical performances designed to break enemy morale before combat even began. The berserkers' pre-battle rituals, howling like animals, biting their shields and working themselves into apparent trances, weren't just displays of madness, but calculated tactics to intimidate opponents. Viking raiders would sometimes perform cruel ritualistic killings of a few victims at the start of an attack, knowing that word would spread and future targets might surrender without resistance. They also used their reputation strategically in negotiations. The danegeld, payments made by targets to avoid Viking attacks, became so common that it entered the language as a term for extortion. At its peak, over 10% of England's entire national income was paid as danegeld to Viking forces. This was organized extortion on a scale rarely seen before or since. Family life and the hidden side of Viking culture. Behind the raids and warfare, everyday Viking life centered around the family farm. The typical Viking lived in a longhouse shared with extended family, livestock, and sometimes thralls. These wooden structures, often with just one room, created intimate communities where privacy was virtually non-existent. Winter nights would find families gathered around the central hearth, sharing stories and crafting necessary items. Here we find the origin of many Norse myths and sagas, tales told and retold through long, dark winters, gradually evolving into the rich mythology we know today. Children's toys found at archaeological sites reveal a surprisingly tender side of Viking culture. Wooden horses, miniature ships, and dolls show that despite the harsh environment and violent aspects of their society, Viking parents cared deeply for their children's happiness and development. Marriage customs reveal the complex gender dynamics of Viking society. While men dominated public life, women controlled the household, including its finances. Divorce was remarkably straightforward. A wife could declare herself divorced simply by calling witnesses and stating her intention 3 times. She would then take her dowry and often half the communal property, giving Viking women financial autonomy rare in the medieval world. Medical knowledge. Surprisingly, advanced Viking healers possessed medical knowledge that in some ways surpassed their contemporaries. Archaeological discoveries have revealed surgical tools capable of trepanation, cutting holes in the skull, with evidence that some patients survived this procedure. They used honey as an antibiotic dressing for wounds, a practice science has recently validated as effective due to honey's natural antimicrobial properties. Viking healers also employed molds with antibiotic properties centuries before the discovery of penicillin, though they understood the effects only through observation rather than microbiology. Viking warriors carried personal medical kits, including needles for stitching wounds and herbs to combat infection. Analysis of battlefield graves shows that many Vikings survived serious injuries that would have been fatal in other medieval armies, suggesting their field medicine was remarkably effective. The Viking diaspora, a global impact. The reach of the Vikings extended far beyond their Scandinavian homeland. They established settlements from North America, Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, to Russia, founding the Kievan Rusi, from which Russia derives its name, North Africa, and even deep into modern-day Turkey as the Varangian Guard, elite bodyguards to Byzantine emperors. DNA studies reveal that nearly 6% of men in the British Isles carry Viking Y chromosomes, with percentages much higher in traditionally Viking areas like Orkney and Shetland. Their genetic legacy extends across Europe and into Central Asia through their eastern trade routes. The linguistic and cultural impact was equally profound. English contains hundreds of words of Norse origin, including common terms like sky, window, egg, knife, and husband. Legal concepts like trial by jury have roots in Viking legal assemblies, and place names across Northern Europe reveal the extent of their settlement and influence. The spiritual complexity of the Viking world. Viking religion was far more sophisticated than the simple Saul worship of warrior gods, often portrayed in popular culture. Their cosmology included 9 interconnected worlds, a complex pantheon of deities with multifaceted personalities, and philosophical concepts like weird, fate, that rivaled Greek and Roman religious thinking in complexity. While Odin and Thor receive most attention today, everyday Vikings were more likely to worship Freyr and Freya, deities associated with fertility and prosperity. Archaeological evidence shows that amulets of Thor's hammer became more common only as Christianity spread, suggesting they became symbols of pagan resistance rather than typical religious items. Perhaps most misunderstood is the Viking concept of the afterlife. While warriors might hope for Valhalla, most Vikings believed in family-based afterlife realms where they would reunite with ancestors. Burial practices confirm this. People were interred with everyday items they would need in the next life, including combs, games, and tools, not just weapons. The end of the Vikings, not with a bang, but a conversion. The traditional narrative of Vikings being defeated and driven back to Scandinavia is largely myth. Instead, the Viking Age ended through gradual assimilation. As Vikings settled in new lands, they adopted local customs, intermarried with local populations, and eventually converted to Christianity. The conversion process wasn't always peaceful. In Norway, King Olaf Tryggvason, 963-1000 CE, forced conversion by threatening torture or death to those who wouldn't abandon the old gods. Iceland's conversion was slightly more democratic. After heated debate at the Althing, National Assembly, they collectively decided to convert to Christianity, while allowing private pagan worship to continue temporarily. By the mid-11th century, most Viking territories had officially converted to Christianity, but pagan beliefs lingered in folklore and customs. Christian churches were often built on old pagan sites, and many Scandinavian Christmas traditions have direct links to the midwinter festival of Yule. The final irony of the Viking Age is that their descendants became some of Europe's most devout Christians. The same warrior culture that had terrorized Christian communities transformed into crusader kingdoms eager to prove their religious devotion through new forms of sanctified violence, redirecting rather than abandoning their martial traditions. We hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share this video. We will always see each other.